When a homeless man requested Clint Eastwood for merely $1, he never anticipated the legendary actor's transformative reaction. It was a pleasant afternoon in Los Angeles, the kind of day where the sun felt just warm enough to keep the chilly breeze at bay. Outside a quiet café on Melrose Avenue, a man sat at one of the outdoor tables wearing sunglasses that partly concealed his face. He was unmistakable. Clint Eastwood, the Hollywood icon. Though years had softened the distinctness of his features, his presence was undeniable. Passers-by occasionally glanced his way, unsure if they should disturb the legend's moment of solitude across the street. Another man stood unnoticed by. Most his clothes were shabby and layered, each piece narrating a story of days spent in the elements. His hair was untidy, and he clutched a small cardboard sign in one hand, while his other fidgeted nervously in his pocket. His name was Kevin, and today marked his third week sleeping behind the dumpster of a nearby convenience store. Kevin hadn't eaten a complete meal in 2 days. His stomach ached at him, a constant reminder of how far he'd sunk as he scanned the cafe for someone who looked approachable. His eyes fixed on Clint Eastwood, at first he hesitated. What could a man like that possibly care about someone like him? But hunger has a way of eroding dignity. Taking a deep breath, Kevin crossed the street, each step heavier than the last. His voice was almost inaudible as he approached the actor's table. "Sir, can you spare $1?" Clint looked up, gradually removing his sunglasses. His expression was inscrutable, and for a moment, Kevin wondered if he'd made an error, but then Clint leaned back in his chair, observing Kevin as if trying to piece together a puzzle. The second stretched on, and Kevin's unease grew. He was ready to apologize and walk away when Clint finally spoke. $1, huh? He said, his tone even then with a hint of a grin. He added, "Sit down, let's talk." But Kevin had no idea what he just set into motion. Kevin hesitated. The invitation felt unreal, almost like a scene out of one of those films he used to watch when life was easier. Sit down with Clint Eastwood. He scanned Clint's face for a sign that this wasn't a cruel joke, but there was no malice there, just a calm curiosity that made him feel both exposed and strangely comforted. With a quiet "thank you," Kevin eased into the chair across from Clint. His hands quivered slightly as he placed the cardboard sign on the table, angling it so it wouldn't catch too much attention. He could feel the intensity of Clint's gaze, but it wasn't critical. It was interested. Like someone who wanted to uncover the story behind the layers of dirt and despair. Kevin wasn't accustomed to this. Most people avoided eye contact or tossed him loose change without a second thought. Nobody wanted to hear his story anymore. But sitting here under the steady gaze of someone he never imagined meeting, the words started to spill out before he could stop them. I'm sorry if I troubled you." Kevin stammered, his voice strained. I don't like asking. I've been trying to find work, but it's difficult, harder than I thought it'd be."
He glanced down at his hands, embarrassed by how desperate he sounded. Clint didn't interrupt. He just listened, which was more than most had done in years. Kevin took a deep breath and continued, the flood breaking. "I was a builder, had a crew, consistent work. Then the recession hit, and the jobs vanished. It didn't take long for the funds to dry up. Then came the overdue notices, and after that," he paused, swallowing hard. "Well, you can guess the rest." He tried to laugh, but it came out bitter and hollow. "Ironic, right? I spent my whole life constructing other people's homes, and now I can't even keep a roof over my own head." Clint's face remained composed, but his eyes softened. Kevin could feel the embarrassment creeping in again, and he tried to steer the conversation away from himself. "I know you probably get asked for things all the time. I don't mean to be another guy with a handout. I don't know what else to do anymore." But Clint wasn't the kind of man to dismiss a story like that. He had a response Kevin never saw coming. Clint leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his hands clasped loosely. The air between them felt heavier, quieter, as if the world had slowed down just for this conversation. Kevin could feel his heartbeat quicken. He half expected Clint to hand him a couple of bucks and politely dismiss him as others had done before. But instead, Clint asked a question Kevin wasn't ready for. "What's your name?" Kevin blinked, startled by the simplicity of the question. "Up, Kevin," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Clint nodded slowly, letting the name settle. "Kevin," he repeated, as if testing how it felt on his tongue. Then after a pause he said, Kevin, I've played a lot of roles in my life, cowboys, soldiers, detectives, and one thing I've learned is that every one of them had a story, good, bad, ugly, it didn't matter. What mattered was how they chose to carry it. So tell me this, what's the next chapter of your story?" Kevin stared at Clint, unsure if he was serious. "The next chapter," he echoed, his voice laced with disbelief. "Yeah," Clint said, leaning back, "you're still here, aren't you? Breathing, talking, asking for $1. That means your story isn't over yet. So what's the next chapter?" Kevin felt a lump. rise in his throat, he didn't have an answer. The truth was he hadn't thought that far ahead in a long time. Survival didn't leave much room for long-term planning. I don't know, Kevin admitted. Finally, I guess I just want to make it through the day. Clint's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in thought. That's not a chapter, Kevin, that's a phrase. You need a chapter, a genuine one, something you can build on. Kevin felt an odd mix of irritation and curiosity. He wanted to ask Clint what he knew about hardship, but he held his tongue. There was something about the way Clint spoke, like he wasn't just throwing out platitudes, but genuinely wanted Kevin to think. Clint reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. Kevin's heart sank. This was the part where the dollar would come out and Clint would send him on his way. But Clint didn't pull out cash. Instead, he pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. Go here, Clint said, his tone steady but not harsh. It's a shelter managed by a friend of mine. They'll help you get cleaned up, find work maybe, even a place to live. But it's up to you to take the first step. Kevin stared at the card, his hand shaking. Why are you doing this? He asked, his voice breaking. Clint's expression softened just slightly. Because someone did it for me once, and I wouldn't be sitting here if they hadn't. But Kevin wasn't sure if he could believe in second chances. Not after everything he'd endured. Kevin's fingers hovered over the business card, as if it were made of glass, delicate and full of promise. He wasn't sure he deserved the name, and address printed on it felt like a lifeline, but the weight of his doubts held him back. Could he truly trust this? Could he trust Clint? I don't know, man, Kevin said, after a long silence, shaking his head. I've tried places like that before. They don't really help. People like me. Clint's gaze didn't falter. People like you. What does that even mean? Kevin swallowed hard, avoiding eye contact. You wouldn't understand. Guys like me, we're just invisible. Clint leaned forward again, his voice calm but firm. You think I've never been down? You think I don't know what it's like to feel like you're carrying the burden of the world and no one's there to help you lift it? Kevin looked up, startled. Clint's face, though composed, carried the weight of his words. I grew up dirt poor in the middle of the Depression. Clint continued. I know what it's like to go to bed hungry, wondering if tomorrow's going to be any better. And let me tell you something, Kevin, it's not about how hard you fall, it's about whether you're willing to get back up even when the odds are stacked against you. The words hit Kevin harder than he expected. He opened his mouth to argue but found he had nothing to say. Clint leaned back, his tone softening. Look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I have all the answers. But what I do know is this: life isn't fair, and it never will be. The only thing you can do is decide whether you're going to let that break you or make you. Kevin felt tears prick the edges of his eyes, but he quickly blinked them away. It's not that easy, he said, his voice cracking. No, it's not. Clint agreed, but easy doesn't mean impossible. It's tough as hell, but if you don't try, you'll never know what could have been. Kevin stared at the card again, his mind racing. He thought about the nights he'd spent on freezing concrete, the meals he'd scavenged from trash bins, the faces that turned away from him every day. And now here was this man, a stranger, a legend, telling him he was worth more than all of that for the first time in years. Kevin felt a spark of something he couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or maybe it was just the realization that he had nothing left to lose. I'll think about it, Kevin said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Clint nodded as if that was enough. Good, that's all I'm asking. But Kevin wasn't the only one impacted by this encounter. Clint had his own reasons for stepping in, reasons that would soon come to light. Kevin clutched the business card tightly as he stood to leave, unsure of what to say or how to feel. Clint's words echoed in his mind, stirring up memories he'd buried long ago, of better days, of dreams that once felt attainable. As he took a few hesitant steps away, he turned back. Thanks for listening, he said awkwardly, his voice barely carrying over the hum of the street. Clint gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. Take care of yourself, Kevin, he said simply before slipping his sunglasses back on and returning to his coffee. But Kevin didn't see Clint's hand tremble slightly as he picked up the cup. He didn't notice the way Clint's jaw tightened for a brief second, as if holding back a surge of emotion. Sitting alone again, Clint let out a slow breath, staring at the empty chair where Kevin had been just moments before. It wasn't the first time he'd been reminded of his past, but it struck deeper this time. He'd been younger than Kevin when he'd first learned how suddenly life could bring you to your knees, growing up during the Great Depression. Clint had watched his parents fight to keep food on the table. There were nights when all they had was a can of beans to split between them. And then there were the strangers, neighbors, church members, sometimes complete unknowns, who had stepped in with small acts of generosity that made all the difference. He remembered one man in particular, a mechanic who'd offered Clint his first job, an opportunity to earn a few bucks cleaning tools. It wasn't glamorous, but it taught him something priceless: the pride of work, no matter how small. That man had seen promise in a skinny kid that no one else did, and it had altered the course of Clint's life. Now, decades later, Clint carried that lesson with him. He'd built a career that most people could only dream of, but he'd never forgotten where he came from or the people who helped him get there. For Clint, helping Kevin wasn't about charity. It was about giving someone else the opportunity he'd once been given. He knew the journey ahead wouldn't be simple for Kevin, but he also knew that sometimes all it took was one person believing in you to ignite something greater. Meanwhile, Kevin wandered aimlessly through the streets, the card still gripped in his hand. He passed by shop windows where his reflection stared back at him, weary, worn, and defeated. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. He stopped outside a laundromat staring at the flickering neon sign with the little money he had left. He decided to wash his clothes if he was going to show up at that shelter. Clint had mentioned he wanted to appear presentable. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. But that first step would be the toughest and the most significant one Kevin had taken in years. Kevin's first visit to the shelter was overwhelming. The fluorescent lights, the sound of hurried footsteps, and the constant buzz of voices made him feel out of place. But the staff was kind. They didn't judge him for the state he was in, and for the first time in years, Kevin felt like someone actually noticed him, not as an issue, but as a human being. Days turned into weeks. And though the path wasn't smooth, Kevin began reconstructing his life. The shelter helped him secure a short-term job at a nearby warehouse where he quickly proved himself to be dependable and diligent with the money he earned. He moved into a humble shared apartment. It wasn't much, but it was a roof over his head and a step toward security through it all. He thought about Clint Eastwood. He'd kept the business card, now worn and creased, as a reminder of the moment that altered everything. One night, after a particularly long shift, Kevin sat down at a small wooden desk in the corner of his humble apartment. The faint hum of the city outside barely reached him as he put pen to paper. He carefully began composing the letter, trying to find the right words to express the deep gratitude that had settled in his heart since that fateful day at the café. His handwriting was shaky at first, as he hadn't written a letter in years, but he took his time. He thanked Clint Eastwood for the generosity he'd shown, not just in giving him $1, but in offering him something far more precious, a moment of kindness in a world that had often been indifferent. Kevin detailed the steps he'd taken since that conversation. He told Clint about the work he had found, the small apartment he now called home, and the hope that had begun to return to his life. He wrote about the struggles, of course, how they hadn't completely disappeared, but also about the newfound belief that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. He didn't expect Clint to reply. The letter was not written with that expectation. No, it was written more as an act of closure, a way to honor the man who had given him a second chance when he had almost lost hope. Months passed, and Kevin moved forward with his life, determined to keep climbing. Meanwhile, Clint was in his quiet office, sipping on a cup of coffee and reviewing some scripts when the letter arrived. He set his coffee aside, took the envelope, and carefully opened it. The words on the page weren't rushed, but carefully thought out. As he read, a faint smile tugged at the corners of his lips. The emotions he had kept under the surface since that afternoon at the café bubbled up, but he quickly pushed them down. Clint was no stranger to tough times. He folded the letter neatly when he was done and placed it in a drawer, along with other mementos that had marked significant moments in his life, a collection of letters, photographs, and memories that reminded him of where he came from and who he had become. For Clint, helping Kevin had never been about recognition or thanks. It wasn't about a simple transaction where kindness was returned with gratitude. It was about continuing the cycle of empathy and generosity that had once been extended to him when he was in need. Clint understood better than anyone that life wasn't about what you accumulated, but about how you shared what you had when it mattered most. Kevin's story was just one of many, but it had struck a chord with Clint because it reminded him of his own struggles during the Great Depression, when a simple act of kindness had set him on a path to a better life. Helping Kevin wasn't charity, it was a chance to pay forward the compassion that had changed his own life all those years ago. Kevin's journey didn't end with the letter, though. In fact, it marked the beginning of a new chapter. Inspired by his own transformation, he decided to give back in the same way Clint had done for him. He went back to the shelter that had helped him get back on his feet and began volunteering. Kevin shared his story with others who were in the same place he had once been. He talked about the darkness, about the loneliness and hopelessness that comes when you feel like you've hit rock bottom. But more than that, he shared the light, the small but significant moments of change that had helped him find his way again. Kevin became a beacon of hope, not just for those in need, but for the community around him. Slowly but surely, he began to transform from someone who had once felt forgotten into someone others turned to for encouragement. The café on Melrose Avenue, where it all began, remained a quiet place, often filled with people rushing through their lives, unaware of the life-changing conversation that had taken place there. To them, it was just another café, another stop on their daily routine. But for Kevin and Clint, it was a place of significance. It was a moment in time that proved the power of human connection. It demonstrated that even the smallest act of kindness, when given at the right moment, can create a ripple effect far greater than anyone could imagine. As the months passed, Kevin continued to thrive. His life wasn't perfect, and he still had his struggles, but he now had a sense of purpose. And Clint, though quiet and private, knew that the impact of that day was far more profound than either of them had realized at the time. Their encounter had changed both of their lives in ways they couldn't have predicted. Clint's belief in the power of simple gestures had been reaffirmed. Kevin's newfound belief in himself and in the goodness of others had also been solidified. For anyone who heard their story, it served as a powerful reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can lead to the greatest transformations. It reminded them that a helping hand, an encouraging word, or even a simple moment of connection can be the catalyst that turns someone's life around. It's a story that speaks to the heart, one that shows us how much power we all hold in the ability to make a difference in someone else's life. If this story inspired you and you want to hear more uplifting stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We'll keep sharing powerful, heartwarming stories with you every day. Don't forget to like and share this video so we can spread the message even further. Also, let us know what you think about this story in the comments. Share your thoughts or even your own experiences. Who knows, your words might just inspire someone else. Remember, together we can create a more positive and hopeful world. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.